So we all know that lots of money is spent every year, billions of dollars are spent every year on tools, technology, and training for the sales force. And this is for a very specific reason, right? We are spending this money in order to get more salespeople to quota, improve our win rates, and generate more revenue. And the hope is that we'll get better ROI, but we don't. We've got these disappointing results from investment after investment. And this cycle just continues. And in fact, one of the most recent statistics is that 40% of sellers are not meeting quota. And this number, this percentage of sellers at quota has been in decline for 6 years running. And we don't seem to see any real light at the end of this tunnel. So lots of investment, very meager results. And what to do about this? What do we do about this cycle of investment and disappointing results? Well, we would say that there's some really good information to be had if you really do your due diligence. So what I'm going to share with you today are seven separate studies that we've conducted over an 8-year period with 27 global sales organizations, over 10,000 salespeople, and over 1,600 sales managers. Now, I'm not going to share the individual results of each of these studies because it would take much more time than we have right now, but I'm going to be referring back to these studies as we navigate our session today. So let's just suffice it to say that we've done our homework at VantagePoint. So what we found, one of the overarching themes of these series of research studies is that there are two faulty assumptions that are alive and well in today's sales force, particularly in the minds of sales leaders and sales enablement leaders. So one of the assumptions is that my sales managers are the least of my worries, they've got this. And the other one is that if we could only standardize on a single methodology and get everybody to be, utilizing that methodology, things would improve. So what about sales execution? How do we go about this differently than we have in the past? How do we avoid selecting yet another sales methodology that we get very excited about and then get meager results, not to mention, eye rolls from your sales force and confusion? Well, it's useful to take a look at the environment that the sellers are facing. And it's a very crowded world out there. So if you ask, what's the best methodology, which many organizations ask, there's a lot to choose from. We've got solution selling. We've got solution selling the strongman process. We've got the new solution selling. We've got strategic selling. We've got the new strategic selling. We've got customer-centric selling, the science of sales success, the challenger sale, sales gurus. Now we're getting spiritual. The masters of sales. We've got the greatest sales book ever written, the best damn sales book ever written, the smartest sales book ever written, and now we're getting legal about it, the laws of sales success. And then we climb to the top of the mountain and we come down with the sales Bible. So you can imagine why organizations struggle so completely to make the right choice when the landscape is so cluttered. And so again, in order to answer this question, what's the best sales methodology? Is there a best sales methodology? And then how do we deploy that in a way that's going to improve sales execution? Again, research to the rescue. And I'm going to be sharing some research that originated at Florida State University in their Sales Institute, pioneered by a gentleman named Dr. Lev Bonney, who's still a professor within the Sales Institute at Florida State University, as well as some of the research that VantagePoint has done to further that original research done by Florida State University. So as it relates to sales execution, we're going to share with you a series of 4 studies and the findings of the studies and what that means for really driving better sales execution. So the first study was a study that was designed to see if the challenger research really was valid. Is the challenger really a thing? The second study was one that determined, do salespeople respond differently when they hit different buying situations? And if so, how does that differ across performers? The third study actually explored when sellers adapt, if they adapt, Does that lead to higher win rates? And finally, the fourth study was to develop a reliable way to be able to diagnose, buying situations and seller behavior. So we're going to talk a little bit about these studies as we go through the rest of this presentation. But let's just start with some of the findings. So in the first study that the Florida State University team did, they were able to replicate the Challenger research. And this was a study about how sellers perceive themselves. So when you ask a seller, what are you? Are you a challenger seller? Are you a lone wolf? Are you a relationship seller, etc.? High-performing sellers are more likely to self-identify as either challengers or consultative sellers. So yes, challenger is a thing. But here's what's interesting. At the end of that first study, one of the sellers that participated in the research reached out to one of the researchers and said, there was a really interesting study that you did, but I found it very hard to answer your questions. And the reason that I found it so hard was because you asked me, am I a challenger? Am I a lone wolf? Am I a relationship seller? Well, it all depends, because sometimes I am a challenger seller. Sometimes I'm a relationship seller. Sometimes, I'm consultative. It all depends. So then they launched the next study, and that study offered 3 distinct and different buying situations that were industry relevant to determine, do high-performing sellers behave differently than the rest? And what they found is, yes, indeed they do. High-performing sellers adapt their selling approach to the buying situation they face. They don't use a one-size-fits-all approach. And sellers who adapt their sales approach actually win more deals. And finally, there is a way to reliably diagnose unique buying situations and the winning sales approach. So what were some of the conclusions from this research that was actually quite groundbreaking at the time? Well, in each customer organization they worked with, they identified 4 to 6 unique buying situations. So for all of these years, all of you out there listening to this have been saying, we knew we were unique, but everyone kept telling us we really weren't that unique, that our problems are similar to other people's problems. But this research actually confirmed, yes, customer buying situations are unique, even within the same industry. They also identified that high-performing sellers exhibit 4 patterns or strategies of sales behavior, not just one. The buying situation drove the winning strategy, and average performers actually were the ones that used only one strategy, and it was the strategy they were trained on. So when you're actually deploying a one-size-fits-all sales methodology, whether it's, strategic selling or whether it's the sales Bible, this research concluded that the only ones who really follow that methodology are your average performers. So when you're deploying that one-size-fits-all methodology, you're actually training people to be average, not high performers. So let's make this a little bit more relevant to this audience. We have one of our medical device clients where we did this work with them. And when we gathered the data, what we found is that they had 5 different and distinct buying situations that their sellers were facing. Now, I'll tell you a little bit later how we come up with this information, but suffice it to say, it's a lot of machine learning and a very sophisticated algorithm. So in this particular medical device client, they had 5 different and discrete, unique buying situations. Now, another goal of the diagnostic was to determine, how do sellers behave? What are the patterns of their selling behavior? And in this same medical device company, what you see here is the lighter blue is everyone else, the darker blue is the top performers. And you can see that there's some pretty significant variation in the selling approaches used by these different levels of performers. Particularly, what you can see is the second approach, which is what we'll call disruptive, more of a challenge approach. High performers are significantly more than twice as likely to use this approach versus everyone else. And then when you look at the competitive strategy, which is really a product-focused strategy, the average and low performers are much more likely than high performers to use a product-focused strategy. Now, we also examine which of the 4 patterns is most likely to lead to a win in any given buying situation. So we looked at the 5 situations. You can see them detailed along the bottom of this chart. You can see that, and you can also see consultative, disruptive, competitive, and financial. Those are the 4 patterns of seller behavior that we identified in this research. So in the first buying situation, a competitive or product-focused approach was much more likely to lead to a win. In the second situation, a disruptive was the most effective. In the third, it was a financial. In the fourth, also a financial or ROI driven. And in the fifth, it was consultative. So if you're deploying a consultative methodology, whatever you want to call it, and you're this medical device company, then your methodology really is only effective in 1 of 5 of the buying situations that your sellers face. And that's really alarming. And our client was very alarmed by that. And it completely changed the way they look at sales enablement for their sales force. So we've discovered that top performers are agile. But the next question that you're probably wondering, and so were these researchers, how do you train agility? And that was a really difficult question because when the researchers looked across the industry and evaluated many, many different sales training and enablement companies, they couldn't find one that was actually training sellers to be agile. They weren't training in agility. So they had to look outside of the sales training industry. And I'm going to put these 3 different types of roles, and I want you to think for a moment about what these different groups have in common. Fighter pilots, athletes, and first responders. Because that's where the research team had to go to find out, how do you actually train agility into the position? So what fighter pilots, athletes, and first responders all have in common is that the decisions they make and the actions they take have immediate and dramatic consequences. And when we look into these different types of roles, we have to actually dig under the hood to find out what they do. So this research team actually went to some, military installations. They interviewed some football coaches and teams. They even went to some trauma centers to determine, how are you preparing these, fighter pilots, athletes, and first responders to be agile in the moment. And what they found is that there really are, we'll use the military as an example, just because that's probably the easiest. There really are sort of 3 prongs to creating agility for any given population. The first part is you have to have situational intelligence. And the military does this by an acronym they call DOPE. And that is data on previous engagements. So the best way to be able to determine what might happen in the future is to do a very thorough job of analyzing what happened in the past. So in the military, they look at all types of data around situations like the ones they're going to face and learn as much as they can about the unique attributes of those situations. Once they get a bead on the situation, they then create standard operating procedures to help their soldiers succeed in those situations. And ultimately, they create situational fluency by training and drilling on some of the basics that feed into these standard operating procedures. And you'll see that I've got a little acronym up there called UDA. There's a very famous fighter pilot, and his name is John Boyd. And he was not only a colonel in the Air Force, but he was also a military strategist, actually a quite famous one. And he developed this sort of decision-making framework that's to be used in real time to evaluate the environment and make decisions. And it stands for observe, orient, decide, and act. And if you take a look at these 3 foundational elements of an agility enablement system: situational intelligence, situational readiness, and situational fluency, these same 3 elements occur in the military, in sports teams, as well as with first responders. So what does this look like in a sales environment? How do you create sales agility? How do you create a sales agility enablement system? Well, the first thing you need is situational intelligence. And how do you get that? Well, you have to have a mechanism for identifying your buying situations, how many there are, and what are the attributes of those different buying situations, and which sales approach, which sales strategy is most likely to lead to a win in each of those buying situations. Once we gather that information and we have that situational intelligence, we can then build out those winning strategies, tools, and tactics with high performers so that it's highly relevant to that individual organization and those unique buying situations. And finally, you have to train and reinforce systematic adaptation or adaptation. And when you think about how most sales training works, we start with the training and reinforcement. There's no real situational intelligence. There's very meager situational readiness. We jump right into training. And therein lies the problem. Therein lies the reason that billions of dollars spent on sales training are creating disappointing and meager results. And when you take these three pillars and then you embed a framework of sales management and coaching practices, that's what rounds out your sales agility enablement system. So what happens when you enable your sales force in this way? Well, the first thing we can do is we can eliminate that frontline void by focusing your sales manager effort on coaching that is the most high impact in a rhythm that is achievable, executable, and drives the results you're looking for. We also eliminate the standardized methodology to drive situational agility in a way that's highly relevant and unique to each individual organization. And when you do both of those things and you do them well, you see dramatic improvements in quota attainment, win rates, and revenue attainment. And the numbers don't lie.